you can have like a playground, like with a basketball court and like kids running around playing.
I think we should like add like these little designs on the wall, where it's like a breeze, a tree, where the leaves is just blowing. Cause I got it in my house and it's so pretty.
Like they should have like a couple PlayStations, a couple Xboxes, a couple different TVs. They should have like a whole living room downstairs.
Give them some food and stuff, and tell them what they can do and how, and they can help them get a job and stuff.
If you were going to design a mural for this neighborhood, what should be on it? Squirreling, right? No, they said raccoon. The way you do a mural is the way you do a mural right. Is you don't just hire somebody and they start painting. They come in and they talk to the community and decide what should be on the mural and what's exciting and interesting and beautiful for the community. You've been thinking about stories about the Baltimore that you would like to imagine, right? And so what they are going to do is listen to stories, and you'll see them writing and sketching, and then they're going to go back to their studio. Have produced some artworks and visualizations of what you say.
Vanessa said, turn down gun stores and make it into homes for homeless.
So it can be more than one in Baltimore City.
So it could be more than one in Baltimore City.
More than one what?
Homeless shelters.
Homeless shelters. So tear down the gun stores. Okay. Were there more?
My idea is like based off his idea. I think the home shelter should have like a recreation center.
For my homeless shelter, I have a lot air conditioning, cause that make me feel comfortable in my house.
My name Brianna and I like to add on to the homeless. So for the homeless, we can like rebuild a abandoned building and like give the homeless separate rooms and let them stay there as long as they need to.
A park?
A what?
Boulder park.
A dirt bike park or something? Like, how many of us like the dirt bikes? Like when the boys ride the dirt bikes, right? I like when the boys ride the dirt bikes in the city, right? We the only ones? How many people don't like when they ride the dirt bikes in the city? So how many people feel like it would be better if they had a place to really ride it in the city? Like it would be better if there was somewhere so it would be safe, right?
I think just naturally I pull stuff into it that I'm comfortable with. Let people's imagination kind of fill in what the rest of the architecture looks like and the other scenes that might be happening in these windows. You know, there was a lot mentioned, and so I think I took little snapshots of several of those things happening in this big community space / homeless shelter. But you know, there's plenty more, and I want people to be able to imagine it going onwards, and they can fill in the blanks.
Conversation like started with things they wanted to tear down in the community, all of which made sense, like liquor stores, like abandoned houses were mentioned. But then when they got on the topic, the students, like the homeless shelter, which they also want the community to come to, like a homeless shelter and a community center, really a place of gathering. That was most telling to me. It showed me that they're other-centered and that they're observant of the environment that they're in, and that they really care about helping people. And that was really inspiring to see how everyone had something to contribute when they started to talk about helping the homeless and people less fortunate than them.
So the piece I did was kind of creating like this lively like montage type of like dream imaginatory landscape, just visualizing different vignettes and things you all said that you wanted in your community, from the healthcare to like pets to nature to like people being together in unity and get together and have a good time. So I was really impressed with your thoughtfulness and like fellow feeling for your fellow man and the rest, and wanting to contribute to a better society here in Baltimore.
So there were a few things that like really stuck out to me from what y'all said, and one was the dirt bike park, and you mentioned it could be like one of the city parks here, and I love that idea of making it like a multi-purpose space. So you have this landscape where people can come and they can dirt bike, and other folks can come and have a picnic and stuff. So that's kind of what this one is, and if you look closely, we got squirrels in there, don't worry. And
Do you guys think this is a true representation of what your thoughts are, or is there anything that you would have thought that they would have been able to add?
Like, and that one, like, is a dream that you imagine that could happen, and this is like somewhere it could be, but yeah, there's somewhere it could be. And like a store that's built into like a homeless shelter and all that. It's like inspiring people that like they get out more.
They were inspired by the actual artist paintings when they actually were inspired by themselves. They were just talking and they didn't have any idea of what the end product could look like, but now also realizing that their ideas are valuable, that it can really solve issues.
We actually are going to present this material to some urban planners. Like, this is what kids at Bartlett School would like to visualize. So what you say is actually pretty important. So what would your community center look like?
It would look like it's gonna be a big building. It's gonna be blue, and it's gonna say help the homeless, and it's gonna.
On beauty at work. I hope you can all hear me. I think the mic's working. Good. Welcome everybody, those joining us here, those joining us online. Last night we had this really profound and I think even moving conversation on beauty and science, which opened up a lot of questions on the relationship between beauty and truth. And I think today we're getting a little taste about the relationship between beauty and goodness. We'll say a little bit about what that video is about in just a second. In our study of scientists, physicists, and biologists, we found there were some really interesting differences. Physicists seemed to find beauty largely in symmetry and simplicity. Biologists found beauty in complexity and in visual beauty, like the images that Rob showed us last night. But what they have in common is the pursuit of the beauty of understanding, right? Grasping that inner logic of things that Massimo was talking about. And beauty works in these different ways, drawing us, to these deeper dimensions. But there are also these variations that I think, are really interested in exploring across different fields. And that's what a lot of today's conversation is about, expanding from our launching point in the beauty of science to looking at other fields like architecture, design, and community development, business, and so forth. For this morning's panel, we're going to try to start this conversation looking at how beauty works. Like, what are the mechanisms through which beauty shapes our minds? How is it affecting us through the spaces that we create and inhabit, and the communities that we immerse ourselves in, that we build, that we try to reimagine? I want to start this event with a story of a mayor in the city of Tirana, Albania, Edi Rama. So in 2000, he took over as the mayor of Tirana. This was a city coming out of Soviet occupation, and the buildings everywhere and the landscape was just gray and barren and drab, hopeless. And he looks over the city, and he's an artist by training, so he says, the city needs some color, and he decides to paint one building in the center of the city, one of the many, many gray buildings, bright orange. And it creates a massive traffic jam. People are stunned. They don't know what they're seeing. They don't know what it means. And then he starts other splashes of color, purple and red and blue and so on. And then he asks people, he polls them with two questions. One, do you like it? And two, should I stop? And on the first one, the responses were really mixed. A lot of people didn't really like it. But almost nobody wanted it to stop. And he was walking down the street, a few weeks after one of these buildings was painted, and he saw these two owners of a shop taking down their shutters and replacing it with glass. And he said, what's going on? And they said, we feel safe. He said, why? Is it because I've put in more police protection? Like what protection? No, it's because of the colors. We feel safe because there's beauty. And so beauty can create hope, right? But how does it do it? How does that happen? What's going on in our minds? What's going on in that relationship between us and the spaces we're in? And then how does that change our relationship to each other and our communities? So that's the topic of this first panel this morning. And I want to introduce the moderator for this session, Christine Emba. Christine is an opinion columnist and editor at the Washington Post and the author of Rethinking Sex, A Provocation, as well as contributing editor for Comment magazine. Before joining the Washington Post in 2015, Christine was the Hilton Kramer Fellow in Criticism at the New Criterion and a deputy editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit, focusing on technology and innovation. She grew up in Virginia and holds an AB in Public and International Affairs from Princeton University. Christine, please join us, and panelists, please welcome.
Is this on? Oh, it's on. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm very excited for this panel, actually. I am a journalist, so I have a lot of questions, and I think I'm going to learn a lot from our panelists. But I'll quickly introduce them, and then we can get into the discussion, because I know we have a lot to talk about. So, to my direct left is Dr. Anjan Chatterjee. He's the professor of neurology, psychology, and architecture at the University of Pennsylvania and the director of the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, where he studies the psychological and biological underpinnings of the aesthetic experience in people, places, and things. And I'll direct you to his excellent book, sorry, I'm early in the morning. It's The Aesthetic Self. The Aesthetic Brain, which is a summary of the field of neuroaesthetics. And he's the past president of the International Association of Empirical Aesthetics and the past chair of the Society for Behavioral and Cognitive Neurology. And then to his left is Dr. Julio Bermudez, an architecture professor at CUA, School of Architecture and Planning, where he's directed the Sacred Space and Cultural Studies graduate concentration since 2010. He also co-founded the Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality Forum in 2007, which is a 700-plus member and 64 countries, I think at this point, organization. And he has served as its president since 2015. And then Dr. Sheri Parks, who is responsible for the beautiful video that welcomed us this morning, and she's worn a lot of hats in her career. She's the Emerita Professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, and has spent the last decade as a higher education administrator, most recently at the Maryland Institute College of Art, which is a mildly confusing name, but she can explain that. And she now leads community-based funded social justice projects like the one you just saw now. And she's currently the program director of the National Dye Initiative, a community and economic development project focused on indigo. And then, last but certainly not least, Pallavi Dean plays at the intersection of design and entrepreneurship. So she founded her design firm, Roar, in 2013. She's a trained architect and sustainability specialist and has won multiple awards for work across a range of sectors, including the commercial, hospitality, and residential. She's a former professor of design and strives to implement the latest theoretical and practical research into her firm's designs. And she was named the Architectural Digest Middle East Designer of the Year in 2020. and Designer of the Year globally by Interior Design Magazine in 2021. So this panel is called Beauty at Work, so I'll ask the obvious question here, and maybe we can go down the row so everyone else has a chance to talk a little bit more about their work. So we'll start with you, Anjan. How does beauty interact with your work?
Beauty interacts with our work in a couple of ways. One that is common to many of the scientists in the audience, which is that it serves as a motivator, along with curiosity, as a motivator for how and why we do our work. There's another sense in which beauty is actually the object of our inquiry, which we are interested in a basic science question, which is what is the nature of human aesthetic experiences, of which beauty is one of the most salient ones. So what is beauty is a basic science question. How does the experience of beauty vary, which makes it a cultural question? And why does beauty matter? And that becomes an application or a translational question. So we're interested in all of those. And as you mentioned, one way to organize our thinking is the way the brain carves out the world into people, places, and things. And so we're interested in how beauty works in each of those. And just to point out, in Sheri's video, you get a good example of that, where there are elements of the beauty of people, of the environment, and things in the context of these human artifacts, which we call art, which was an important part of that video.
Julio, talk to us. How does beauty interact with your work in architecture in the built environment?
Well, I'm a professor and a researcher, so there are two parts that I look at beauty. As a teacher of architecture, beauty is in a way a centerpiece of my teaching. And this is a little bit controversial, not so much in CUA, but another school of architecture in which beauty has been for most of the 20th century, certainly from the 50s on, a non-discussable issue. Because there were some other more important issues to address, such as development of humanities after the Second World War, social growth and change, and so on and so forth. So therefore, functionality, technology, and things of that kind begin to take over the discipline, with some understanding. However, beauty, regardless of what people said, most architects still considered it, even back then, as an important thing that they were not supposed to talk about, but everybody wanted to produce beautiful buildings. Of course, we have the tradition of pre-modernity that is in the West and in other part of the world that have evolved a sense of beauty. I mean, classical language, Gothics in the West, for instance, that we could refer to as examples of how humanity have evolved a particular way of engaging the built environment in ways that are pleasing and appealing to perception and experience. But of course, modernity has its own particular way about it. So a big question for me as a teacher is how you bring that up in the classroom, and how you somehow produce pedagogies that articulate both conceptually but also experientially, intuitively, because of course, as we all know, beauty is not found in the intellect. You could articulate it, but in reality, it's a direct experience, or at least I would argue that. So there is that whole conversation that we could have on how you do that. And as an investigator, I'm very intrigued about beauty as a profound, sublime, extraordinary experience that transforms us. One that certainly is not judgmental, one that is certainly, as I said, transformative, in which we succumb to the other in ways that we are not myself anymore. We become in this profound relationship. Plato said that we fall in love with what we find beautiful. So I'm very intrigued about that, and how you begin not only to understand what that is, or how that happened, how the phenomenology of that impossible event in which the physical architecture, the environment, can produce arguably the most metaphysical of the responses, connecting with God. We know, for instance, that sacred spaces, regardless of culture, regardless of time, over and over and over again, have used beautiful buildings as a way to attract people and convey their religion and spiritual understanding. So in this investigation of beauty, for me, I use empirical tools to begin to gauge the immeasurable. So I'm trying to measure the immeasurable in the hope of, like now, I'm trying to express the inexpressible, the ineffable by using words. It's an impossible task, but it's a task that I think for first time in this 21st century, we are able to at least begin to look at things that nobody else before us could do. So it's kind of exciting time in that way.
Indeed. So at 9 a.m. in the morning, we are going to measure the ineffable. So just get ready for that, audience. Sheri, can you tell us a little bit about how beauty interacts with your work? In particular, can you tell us about the video that we just saw and how that works for you?
Okay. So my academic area, my research area is ordinary aesthetics, or what people do in their day-to-day lives to bring meaning and beauty and interest into their lives. So that makes the art and other artifacts a meaning structure. So it's how people talk to each other, how families talk to each other, how communities talk to each other without talking to each other. And that makes art and art-like things. I use the word aesthetics, which is not just art. I'll use them interchangeably today, if you'll allow me, if my colleagues will allow me, because that's sloppy, but it's quick. It makes it an extremely important tool for social justice. So there are things that people, regardless of culture, do all over the world. They eat, they have sex, they make art, everywhere. And so there are things that art does. I think of art as having muscle. I mean, what can it do? I mean, we often think of art as it's nice. Brandon, the drug dealers of Baltimore know what you found, that if you plant flowers, they move. They understand the aesthetic of despair. And so you just keep planting flowers until they're gone, which I find fascinating. And so I'm very interested in the way art moves in people's lives and how they use it or receive it in meaning making. So what you saw was part of an NEH-funded project around narrative in Baltimore. It came out of the Baltimore Uprising in 2015. And these are kids in a very much underserved community. And we asked them we didn't say it this way because they're kids, but what is the utopia Baltimore? And I didn't ask them about homeless shelters. The level of empathy that they said, there are people worse off than we are. And they began to build the best homeless shelter in the world. And the squirrel, the part I have to explain, they were brilliant because they don't, well, now they do actually, but when this was built, they had very little green space. I like to think that the urban planners, because I sent it to the city, listened, and they actually did. They said, we refer back to those paintings. But they said, if we have a squirrel, you have to have a tree, and that means you probably have a grass. And so the squirrel became code for an ecosystem of parkland. And that's why both painters were, you saw in the dreamscape, the squirrel was huge and they fall out laughing. And what the counselor makes clear in this video is that they wouldn't have thought those thoughts if I just walked in and said, what do you want to happen in Baltimore? I mean, they would have looked at me. But the painters made it different. The painters inspired them. And I learned that day that it matters when your ideas come back to you in oil. Both painters were using what the kids called real art, and they were honored. Because the painters came back ready to change, and they said, no, this is perfect. You got what we said. And it was deeply meaningful to them. And those paintings are in that building now. They hang on permanent, semi-permanent. I check them now and then to make sure they're still there. But And that's the way art works. The idea, there's a concept called organizational aesthetics. It's often used in marketing, but it can be used in much, where we know that the art brings up the what we'll call unconscious. Excuse me, Anjan, I know that's an overly simplistic term. We know that both in the artist, but also in the person who is perceiving the art, that it can pull up things that would not have otherwise been pulled up. That's enormously powerful. And so I think it's really important that I think it's irresponsible to teach people to be artists without teaching them the power of their art. Because then they're just kind of willy-nilly. They're people with guns who don't know how to use them. But also the ethics of using them responsibly. So I'm deep in the weeds in that way. By training, I am an ethnographer. So I've spent time in people's homes and mapped how they are using things. And I tell my students the simple way to do it is to follow the dog. The dog will take you to the hearth place and just sit there for 2 hours. And they think it's the lamest assignment in the world until they do it. And I first asked them to take photographs of this room. And families won't let them do it because that room is always untidy. Because it's where you put your feet up, it's where you eat, you do things like that. And then they just map what they see and how the family moves around it and what that means for what's called the family mythology, the meaning structure of the family. So that's a very simple way of what I do, but then we turn it around and use it for social justice, which is what we're doing.
That's incredible. I love that.
Thank you.
An interesting note about the squirrel in this story, actually, these layers of representation and meaning. I learned recently, and Julio, you can probably tell me if this is correct, that squirrels are non-native to a lot of American cities and were introduced in like the 1800s as a way to teach urban youths boys especially, how to be kind. That they would fall in love with these little small animals and that would make them sort of better humans. So it's objects, it's art, it's the representation of what the object means. And Pallavi, I mean, you work in design, so I think you probably have a lot of familiarity with these objects, but also sort of their place in the home and the office space. How does beauty interact with your work?
Wow, I think it's integral to my work, right? In many ways, I think I sell beauty every day. Through 5 years of architecture school, one of the big questions was form or function. Everyone's heard this before, right? And obviously, as a 17-year-old, young, naive student, I was like, obviously, both. As a good architect, it's going to be evidence-based at its core. It's going to be functional, but it's going to be poetry. Now, 20 years of practice, I believe they're mutually exclusive, right? I don't think you can have form and function both. And the reason I say that is, was it last year? Yes, last year we unveiled the Museum of the Future in Dubai, right? That's where I live and work. And it is a stunning piece of architecture. Some people say it's the most iconic, beautiful building in the world. And I'm very proud that it is Dubai. It was delayed. It's this gorgeous stainless steel piece of, art, which has got Arabic calligraphy on it, 77 meters high. But the project was delayed. It was extremely expensive. It was a structural nightmare. So is that functional or is that just form? And it really makes me question most of what I do on a daily basis. I can't have both. I can either make something poetic and just to express myself or to express a client's vision, or I can actually make it functional. And, they might meet somewhere in the middle, like 60-40, 70-30, but for something to be truly beautiful, that has to be the pursuit. And I know I'm sitting on a panel with academics and they're going to quote you science journals and whatnot. So let me bring it to mainstream. I was watching the movie Air. Anyone's watched the movie Air recently? And when Sonny, one of the guys, goes to the shoe designer and he says to him, design me this, the latest, greatest shoe. And he asks him the question, form or function. And the shoe designer says to him, listen, poetry gives meaning to life, but engineering got us to the moon. So you kind of, you can pursue beauty, you can pursue art, but somewhere you kind of have to ground yourself. And I think for me in my work, it's always that battle, bringing myself to reality, letting myself go. So yeah, that's kind of where my work sits.
That is also fascinating. I mean, I think we'll go back to Anjan for the next question here, because thinking about where beauty grounds itself, I mean, we observe it, we take it in via the eyes and the mind. Can you tell us a little bit about the actual scientific implications of this? Like, what does beauty look like in the brain? How do we sort of carve it out and assign value to it, maybe?
So listening to this conversation, I'm struck by, I've been going back to reading about the Romantics, particularly the German and English Romantics in the late 18th century, and the way in which they were reacting to the age of enlightenment. And all of these issues of what's kind of desiccated functional science and the way in which we respond to beauty in the world of feeling, were issues that they were dealing with. And I'm finding it quite fascinating that 225 years ago, that these same issues that we are all struggling with were so germane. So going back to your question, for us the issue is always beauty of what? That kind of beauty as an abstraction ends up not giving us much purchase. So if you talk about beauty of faces, or beauty of places, or beauty of art, the nature of the questions can vary. So to a first approximation, as I mentioned, our visual system carves out the world into people, places, and things. There are parts of our occipital cortex that are tuned to faces. There are parts that are tuned to environments and the built environment, including the built environment. And there are parts that are tuned to object. There are parts tuned to visual motion. And beauty in a face, again, as to a first approximation, is when you have simultaneous neural activity within parts of the brain that are specific to processing faces and our reward systems. So these are in the deep structures of the front of the brain. They have fancy names, like things like the nucleus accumbens, orbitofrontal cortex. But it's when there's a simultaneous activity of a domain-specific area, which could be faces or places, it could be the auditory cortex for music, and a domain-general part of the brain, which processes rewards and pleasures. And so that simultaneous activity is at least a biologic description of what the experience of beauty is. Now if you introduce expertise, so you have architects looking at beautiful buildings in a way that they might look at it differently than people without that kind of expertise, you still have that same pattern, but you have other parts of the brain coming into to bear on the response. And that often has to do with parts of the brain that are oriented towards knowledge and memory. And so this can be demonstrated using imaging experiments where you have people with design expertise or architects and lay people, and you can see these kinds of differences. So generally, there is a kind of domain-specific response and then a domain-general one. And then the other point I would make that we've been very interested in is that while our brain is very good at discriminating objects, right? So we have, most people can tell the difference between faces pretty quickly. But we're not very good. Our brains are quite promiscuous when it comes to values. And so the idea that goodness and truth and beauty tend to be conflated in the brain, and this raises certain kinds of questions, and we've been interested as an ancillary to in the question of the shadowy side of beauty. Is there a seduction to beauty that can lead us astray?
The seduction part is something that I think we'll return to a little bit later. But I'm interested in this idea of measuring beauty, actually. We so often talk about beauty as though it's, yes, the ineffable, that there's no way to really pin it down. But Julio, you've also talked about this a little bit, the idea of a beautiful building or a beautiful place. What is a beautiful building? Like, is there an empirical way that we can say, you know, this is objectively beautiful, this isn't? And what does that look like in the field? Do we still believe that?
Well, I mean, these days, politically correct people say that everything is constructed. So there is no way to produce an universal anything, which I disagree. I think we are Homo sapiens, going back to it, some of the Anjans. We are constructed a certain way. We walk upright. The doors of perceptions are certain and no others. And the brain operates a certain way than others. Of course, culture, personal upbringing, expertise, all that stuff enters the consciousness. I think the question of unconscious, or better said, the non-conscious, is basically what we are all somewhat the commonality about it, right? There are certain things that we tend to perceive, like proportion, scale, materiality, textures, proportions, harmony, height of buildings, sound. Those things conform what I would call the envelope or the environmental dimension of architecture. And those things, if produced in coherent, in harmonic ways, will invite particular reaction of humanity. Now, of course, after that, there is all this much more conscious aspect that highlight, the text. The way I would think, imagine you have a page, an old text, and then you begin to highlight it, right? You have an impression, beginning impression of the composition of that page, and then your eye goes to what is highlighted, but the first thing is the whole page. And there is a lot of that happen in this unconscious aspect of it. We're trying to test this right now with our eye tracking mobile work supported by Templeton. Exactly this question, this precognitive, if such thing exists, the thing that comes just before I even am aware, and then what happens, I am aware. Well, now that I have this perception, what is I pay attention to? And there is some hypothesis about that. There is a lot in the building that, going back to what you're saying, I think our beauty is based on sacrifice. People had to put time and effort and money into a building for the building to begin to have this presence. I don't think you get nothing for nothing. I mean, when you go to these ancient buildings or even contemporary buildings, I'm thinking buildings that are very controversial, like the Oculus by Calatrava in New York, that people have all kind of issues because it went, too expensive, it's about shopping, blah, blah, blah. But if you go to the building and you go with an open mind, it's the best cathedral for the ordinary person that 21st century has created. And I would just make that case right now. So that is a big sacrifice that somebody did for 200, 300,000 persons a day that cross that amazing thing. And I think we sense that. We sense that in our bones, in our heart, and we sense it not just individually, but collectively. So anyway, so there are ways to measure these things, and I can speak more. I'm sure that Anjan can do it better than I can, but there are ways in which we begin to be able to measure. We are far from, especially out of the lab, to do these things, but at least we begin to point out, for instance, how the default mode network is interrupted or is profoundly disrupted, which is because attention is called by the beautiful. The beautiful, we cannot remain aloof. It called for attention, and there suddenly the whole brain go from this, mind wandering to focus. And suddenly the ordinary way of operation changes dramatically. That's something very easy to measure, actually, even by rudimentary EEGs. Anyway, I stop there.
I mean, we're going to come back to that because that contains so much. But actually, I'm going to jump to Pallavi very quickly for this one. One of the things I noticed in this conversation is, or at least what you were saying is, we talk about the cathedral, sort of the classical buildings, but that's a very Western building style, and Pallavi is our only international participant on this panel right now. So I wonder, are there shared threads in the understanding of what beauty looks like that cross cultures that you've seen, or what has that looked like for you? I know we were actually talking about fashion as we were sitting up in the front row just this morning.
Let me ask you a question, right? How many of you in the room, and just a show of hands, have reacted to a human, to nature, to object, and gone, ah, that's beautiful? Okay, so we're in a very diverse setting right here, right? But like Julio said, we're all just Homo sapiens, we're humans. When we see something that's calling to us, we all react. I love what you said about walking into a cathedral. Now that could be a mosque, that could be a synagogue, that could be a temple. And the reason why we react as humans is the scale. You know, Anjan and I were just talking about how beautiful the ceiling is, right? Okay, would I ever design something like this? No, because I'm a very contemporary architect, but I can appreciate it. And why am I appreciating it? For a couple of reasons. Everything that Julio has just touched on: balance, symmetry. You know, you look at Islamic geometry, it's so intricate, like it's so rich. But at the same time, I can also appreciate a brutalist building, which has very clean lines, which is, or a modernist building, which is just devoid of any ornamentation, right? Because it follows those principles of balance, symmetry, harmony. And we can harp on about this because that's what we do. But one of the things that I want to kind of bring here, and you talked about fashion and things like that, for me, beauty is tangible. Okay, so we do a lot of work in the metaverse, in the NFT space, right? But it's never really taken off. And I kept asking myself, why is that? Because the metaverse or Web 3.0, whatever it is, it's not immersive yet. What do I mean by that? It does not engage our 5 senses in the way that sitting in this room is engaging at least 4 of my senses. I mean, like, okay, there's water, you know, which is kind of tantalizing the taste buds. But my point is that for me, and this is personal, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, right? Beauty has to be tangible, to have that visceral kind of reaction, which is why I feel happiest when I'm walking down Central Park, or, you know, when I'm looking at the dunes or the deserts, right? Because I can touch it. But with a metaverse space or with NFTs, it's just, you know, it's just an image. Like, what's that? But anyways.
That's a great point. I am personally very suspicious of the metaverse, in that I think it's actually created to deaden us in some ways, to remove us from the tangible and take us to a place where we don't have to think about how the world, yeah, exactly. It may just be sort of crumbling around us, but it's art put to that nefarious in my ideal purpose. And so Sheri, I actually want to turn to you for this question, and also panelists, we should just feel free to jump in on this conversation. Just give me a wave.
I wanted to say, and not to take this away from you, Anjan has research on exactly this thing, on the aesthetic experience and what it means. So can I yield my time a little to him?
I will, but I'm going
yes,
to ask one question
yes.
first, and then maybe you should both take
it. I want to hear your answer before I respond.
Well, my question for you, Sheri, and I think this maybe both of you can talk about this, is art is tangible, art makes us feel things, but in your work with social justice, in your work with art and communities, is it used to make us feel things to sort of distract us from the circumstance? Can art be used sort of as the opiate of the masses to quiet people down, or does it actually awaken us? And what's the difference? Can you use art differently in both of those ways?
Oh, very, very much so. I mean, that's been written about a lot, of art's ability to be healing. And there are people here who are doing trauma-informed practice, and so it can be healing. Quote, it can be a balm for the wounded soul. That's what got African Americans through slavery and Jim Crow, foodways and spirituality and art, and it can do that. It can actually do both at the same time, because it can help you to imagine and to practice situations that are dangerous in any other way. I mean, we saw women in the Middle East during the Spring Uprising where they couldn't meet in person, but they could meet online. You know, Second Life, which, do you remember that? Yes. And it allowed them to think through things, to practice things in ways. So what's wonderful about art is that it can do all of the above. It can do all of the above at the same time. And so we can't separate it. We do, because we dissect things, that's what we do. But when we look at the lived experience, people are doing all of those things at the same time.
So Anjan, now we're going to throw it back to you.
So the way we tend to carve out the space is something referred to as the aesthetic triad, which is that there are sensory motor qualities of the experience. There's the emotional experience itself, and the way in which meaning and semantics plays into this. And so you can take each of those in turn, and to underscore what Pallavi said, which is the sensory experience is absolutely critical to many of these kinds of aesthetic experiences. There are occasional exceptions, and we heard a little bit about this last night, which is the beauty in mathematics, which is very much of a conceptual beauty, and it's not obvious how sensory systems really play into this. But for most of us, sensations are absolutely critical to beauty, and that has a link directly to emotions. And as Julio said, this happens very quickly. The first response to beauty can happen within 250 milliseconds, and then there's a later wave that happens about a second and a half. And what's happening in those two different epochs might be quite different. But there's an immediate response, and what we find is that within visual cortex, within our sensory organs in the brain, that valuation is occurring. So you could imagine a design of the brain that says the back of the brain carves out the world into objects of different kinds, and the front of the brain imposes value. But we find that all the way in early processing, value is already embedded in it. And so the way in which sensations and value are really tied together in the brain is quite extraordinary as far as that goes. And when it comes to the meaning, one of, Julio has talked about the ineffable, and we've been very interested in this, of how do you measure the ineffable, and what is the ineffable? And part of the question around ineffability is knowing what is effable. And that brings us to language, and this is where the cognitive parts comes in. So we have, again, like this conference and Julio's work, we do have a project funded by the Templeton Religion Trust, which is trying to have a taxonomy of vocabulary to identify what impact art or beauty or aesthetic experiences have, to really lay out a vocabulary, because until you have a nuanced way of describing these experiences, you don't really get to the ineffable until you've exhausted what is actually effable, at least as our take on this.
It's really interesting what you said about value and beauty, and I was telling you this earlier. I think my husband is the most gorgeous man in the world. I think my best friend is a supermodel.
Is he listening? Is that why you're doing this?
Love you, baby.
This is the seduction part is happening right here.
This is the seduction part. Getting it. 20 years later, right? I still think he's gorgeous. I think my children are divine. But that's just because I love them. And my husband will always say to me, he's just like, you only find this person good looking because you like them. Anjan, can you tell me what's wrong with me? Like, why is it that I just find nice people beautiful?
I think that's a nice thing, actually.
It's a lovely thing, but that goes back to what Anjan was saying about value and beauty, because no matter how beautiful someone is, if they were not a nice person, I don't think I would find them attractive.
Well, what's wrong with you is you're human. So should I continue? Okay. So I don't want to hog the stage. So one of the things that we've been finding is that, and this goes back to the seduction of beauty, the shadowy side of it, and not to suggest there's anything shadowy about you and your husband, but there is something that social psychologists have talked about a fair amount, which is the beauty is good stereotype. And this is, the phenomena is that attractive people get all sorts of unearned advantages in life. People who are attractive tend to be hired more easily, are given higher pay. Attractive people, when they need help, many more people are willing to help them. Students who are attractive are given higher grades unless it's a standardized test. And so this is what I mean by a kind of conflation where attractive people are also thought to be more intelligent, more trustworthy, more competent, and so on. And we've been finding an unfortunate corollary to that, which is when people have minor facial anomalies. So this can be scars, it can be burns, it can be developmental abnormalities. There's an implicit view that such people are less competent, less trustworthy, less intelligent. We have worked out some of the neural basis of this, and we think there is a very big cultural component to this. So we've studied a hunter-gatherer tribe in Tanzania and find that they don't make the same kind of stereotypic judgments that we have found in every other population we've studied. And just to give you an example of how this is reified by culture, again, taking a lesson from Pallavi, by raise of hands, how many of you in this audience have seen movies that are either The Lion King, a Bond movie, or a movie in the Marvel universe? Just raise your hands. Each of those worlds show villains with facial disfigurements. In The Lion King, right, the only character that doesn't even get a name is Scar. So this is the message we are giving our 3-, and 4-, and 5-year-olds. And once you see this, I promise you, if you see this, you will not be able to unsee it. Every time you turn on something, right now Mother is one of the most popular shows on Netflix, same thing. So I think the way our culture also pushes this idea is really quite profound.
So Sheri, there must be a social justice component here. I mean, have you thought about this in your work?
Well, first I want to talk about squirrels, because we had an example here.
Let's bring it back to squirrels.
You know, squirrels are fluffy and they were brought in to suggest empathy. And if you've ever lived around a squirrel, a little block from a state park, they're vicious. They're carnivores. And so the meaning we have built around these fluffy vermins, which is what people from Europe often call them, is because they're cute. And so we do that all the time. And one aspect is, I think, a little different than what you're asking, is Anjan's work, I think, informs race and how we perceive race and who gets to be beautiful. And of course, you and I have lived through a period where that has been, Beyonce's a lot of it, but what is allowed to be beautiful has changed. When I was young and wanted to pierce my ears, my mother said, I don't want you to pierce your ears because then you cannot be Miss America. It was kind of her way of, I was never going to be Miss America. And I said that, I said, they don't let us be Miss America. Well, of course, there have been several, I think most of them in the last 10 years have been women of color. And so what's interesting about that is that it does and can change. And that's what I mean by meaning structures that people bring and communicate, so that my 28-year-old, who is gorgeous, even by Anjan's standards, knows it, right? It doesn't question it, kind of, thank you very much, and goes on her way. And so what people bring to it then can be used. So right now, you mentioned the Natural Dye Initiative. And what that is a multi-part project where we introduce farming of indigo, which is very, for dye, which is very expensive and very rare at this point. In the United States, it was a slave crop. So we're reintroducing the propagation of indigo to black farmers in Baltimore City, and Maryland Eastern Shore, South Carolina, on some of the same land that slaves grew indigo, now this summer in North Carolina. and Virginia are coming on. Then the indigo comes back to Baltimore, where returning citizens, now notice this is an art-based project, or returning citizens then hang it to dry, and we have the funding to mill it into dye and sell it. At the same time, we're training artists and makers, and we're giving them the indigo because it's expensive and rare, and teaching them how to dye things with it, and we're creating an online marketplace where they can sell it. So notice here, beauty is not separated in any way. It's woven through the entire process. Indigo, given to the conversation last night, is holy, is sacred all over the world. Starts in India and moves through Asia. And we're not proselytizing, but we're honoring that, partly because the community made us. So we do these workshops that are free, where we take the indigo vats on horse-drawn carts into underserved neighborhoods, and we teach them about how to do it, and then we hand out T-shirts, and they dye their T-shirts. We teach them how to do West African designs on their T-shirts. And what adults began to report to us was that they felt different after they did the indigo. And we give them, indigo stains your hands, and we were giving them gloves, and we noticed that almost everybody was taking their gloves off so they could plunge their hands into the dye. And they were leaving with their dyed shirts, but they're also leaving with their dyed hands. Those of you who have seen Daughters of the Dust will recognize that motif. So we could not ignore, it's a community development, economic development. We don't use the word reparations because that makes funders nervous, but there is repair here. We've seen farmers in South Carolina cry because they're getting to grow indigo again. So there's healing, there's trauma healing, there's historical healing, there's cultural development. Indigo is very expensive, so we're bringing them in at the top of the market. We paid farmers $20 a pound last summer, which you cannot do with anything other than cannabis. And so it doesn't have all of the issues of cannabis, including the racial discrimination for licenses. But it is based on the idea that it is beautiful. The community is happy that indigo, at the end of the season, we let it bloom so we can collect the seeds. And the community is very happy because we're also growing it on brownfields in the city, that it is pretty and that the dye is pretty. And so the aesthetic experience is very complex here because it's embodied. I mean, they feel something. They're literally staining their bodies. And then artists and makers dye things, and we will sell them and feed that wealth back into the community through an economic structure that I won't go into here. But notice, I mean, that is the way aesthetics work. You get a piece of that in others, but when you look at how people do art, live with art, make art, you begin to see its full potential. And many people here know that you get much more a response in the doing of art than in the consumption of art. Consumption of art is very important, I'm not saying that, but it is an important chunk of a larger process.
This image of the hands stained with the blue, and it's indigo is this very rich blue, is really wonderful. I also love this thread of blue cross-culturally being something beautiful, something holy and maybe ineffable in some ways.
Guatemala, what we call South Carolina indigo really came from Guatemala, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, Korea, Japan, those are the major. And now Baltimore.
Congratulations to Baltimore. I mean, Julio, we've used the words, this is pretty, this is beautiful, and in some ways the way that the academics on this panel have talked about beauty does feel a little bit different from the way that people talk about beauty in the real world. Is it just sort of prettiness, or is it just based on desire, the wanting for this rich color, the wanting for this expensive product, or is it something else going on there?
So, for the moment, I'm bypassing that question, but I want to bring the issue of transcendence and beauty. We're at the Catholic University of America, and there is a long tradition in the Catholic faith, but also in many other faiths, and also in philosophy that connects God and beauty. So just a couple of thoughts on that. This is August 1994. I'm entering the Pantheon for first time. 1997, August also, in Tokyo, enjoying Shinsendo. It's a very small house by some Zen master. June 2007, the Muhammad Ali Mosque in Egypt. And I can continue a couple more of these. Those are moments that I lost myself and I cry like a baby. There was no value attachment at the beginning. I felt in communion with the universe. In some quarter, they call it non-dual experience. I felt definitely an existential realization of liberation and profound transformation within myself. These were all architecture experiences. After these experiences, I conducted a survey and got about 3,000 answers, 1,000 stories of people around the world that had these experiences. And that shows that I'm not the only one that had these amazing things. What beauty could do is amazing. And it can go from social justice and the conversation that we just heard and saw the video to this more profound realizations, all in this continuum. And I think it's something that we often do not acknowledge and we do not talk enough. And I think, of course, we can approach this from so many perspectives as this conference is doing. But to me, this is what I'm very intrigued about, this door to the transcendence, perhaps more than to other dimensions. This is just Julio, right? Doesn't mean the other dimensions are not important. But the fact that we could, that this can happen at all, it's just a miracle. It's a true miracle. The question of Kant, Immanuel Kant talked about this interestedness. The fact that in order for you to arrive to this sublime and the positive side of sublimity is the fact that there is no business transaction. I'm not getting this to get something. I am not interested. I'm falling in love for love's sake. In the possibility of being brokenhearted, I open myself, I leap, and I don't know if the net will appear. There's a sense of surrendering, and there is so much to this. You know, there's psychology to it, there is neuroscience to it, there is anthropology to it, there is social justice, there is equity, there is all these things. But I just wanted to bring that issue because I think it's, in this campus, we could talk these things and we don't sound so weird, right? But it's so, so powerful.
Can I tell a story of that miracle?
Please.
There are people in Canada who work with child soldiers, lost boys, with dance. And what happens with child soldiers is that the trauma they've been through helps them dissociate, which is how they can do atrocities with seemingly no emotion. And you can spend years of therapy, and often this is done in association with therapy, but they use dance. And we brought them to the University of Maryland, and I said to the faculty member, we have children soldiers in the US. And she said, who? And I said, young gang members. And so it took a very long time for me to convince the gang unit to let us have young people come to campus. They tested me in all kinds of ways, and they finally said, we're going to give you the girls because they're way tougher than the boys. And so, you know, the young women came in, and one of the largest in physicality women, and I won't use the word she used, but she made it very clear that she considered herself to be the toughest woman in the room. And so they started working with them, and they said, show me a movement where you have hurt somebody. And this had freaked out the students the day before, but they did it immediately. Now show me a movement, how it felt when someone hurt you. And that was harder. And they ended up making a dance, but this woman had come and sat down, and we had brought in dancers, but we were clear that aesthetically they had to, you know, they had tattoos, they had piercings, the preppy students didn't get to participate in this, so there were aesthetic choices that were very important. And the students have been trained to go and sit down with people who dropped out because it was hard, and eventually she comes back in. They don't ask her to come back in, but she rejoins the group. At the end, they do this dance, and it was Valentine's Day, and I had bought roses. I know, economically not wise, but I bought roses, and I handed them out, and she began to cry, and she hugged me. Now, she walked in threatening, and by the end, and that took an hour and a half. Try to do that any other way, I don't know how.
Anjan, did you want to jump in? Yeah, try and follow that.
It's scary following Sheri on a comment like that. But I did want to get back to something that we talked about in our preparatory meeting, this idea of Sheri's interest in everyday, quotidian aesthetics, and Julio's in these kind of transcendent, profound experiences, and kind of the range between that. And again, this notion of transcendence, and maybe a cousin to that of transformation, that that you can have in a smaller way these kinds of transformations that occur, which art can be a vehicle for. And one of the projects we've been involved with is not far from here at Walter Reed Military Medical Center, of using art therapy in people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress symptoms. And it is a national tragedy, I think, in the way that we don't really take care of our veterans after they return. It also turns out that art therapy has never really been subjected to any kind of rigorous study. And in this project, we have people doing self-portraits on a blank paper mache mask at the beginning of the intervention, and after an 8-week period, redoing that and getting back to notions of ineffable. It turns out that for many people in this situation that are traumatized, have a very hard time putting into words what their experience and their internal state is, but they find they can do something as a self-portrait, an emotional self-portrait that ends up being enormously powerful, and then they can talk about it. Once it's externalized, they can talk about it. And these expressions, when you read their descriptions, are very powerful, and at least one gets the sense of a kind of transformation. Might not reach the point of transcendence in the way, Julio, you're thinking about, but again, in a smaller way, it seems as though, in this case, expressivity is an important piece of what art can do, and it is a vehicle that we're finding seems to make a difference.
I want to turn to you, actually, because now we're talking about objects. I mean, whether it's a self-portrait or a mask or something. How do these everyday objects hold beauty and function as meaning makers for us? And you talked a little bit about form versus function. Are there ways that you can try to infuse both? Do you sometimes just favor one side over the other for aesthetic purposes?
Yeah, I think, with objects or art, there is also value or meaning that you attach to it, right? So I could have an object at home which is very dear to me because it's an heirloom piece, or it's something that I found on a trip with my little boys, and it's just a piece of stone, but it has so much meaning to me. And that's why I'm so interested in Anjan's work, and a lot of the conversations yesterday about what is the truth of beauty, it's about the meaning and value we attach to it. It was interesting what, Julio, you were saying about walking into the Pantheon. I have never felt that with a man-made structure. I've never, ever, and I tried, okay? I walked to every beautiful piece of architecture because I am an architect, but I've only ever felt that transcendence in nature. Because for me, nothing in nature is perfect. And us as humans, There is so much perfection attached to these buildings or these structures that we make, not a screw out of place. We're so OCD. And I'm all of those things, which is why whenever I'm on a trek or I'm diving, that's when I transcend, because I am seeing, I don't believe in God, but I'm seeing something that is bigger than me, in front of me, and it takes me to a different dimension, whatever dimension that is. And I find it interesting that you find it in man-made structures, and I can't see it. So yeah, for me, objects, it's all about value. It's about meaning. It's about what value and meaning you attached to that building when you walked in. And again, with the therapy work that you're talking about, it's so powerful because this is beauty creating change, creating transformation. But it's because your work is so meaningful and powerful, and that's why it's creating all that change. Do you know what I mean? So you as a human is bringing beauty into that situation rather than it being an object or a place or a moment in time.
One of the most interesting sort of popular art and beauty phenomenons that I've been following over the past few years is the new familiarity that Americans have with the Japanese tradition of wabi-sabi.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Explain what that is. You'll be better than I.
But that just goes back to what I was saying. There is nothing perfect in nature, and that's what wabi-sabi is. It is finding these imperfect objects and finding the beauty in them. And it's almost kind of, all of us are imperfect, right? There is nothing perfect about any of us. I can think of a million flaws that I have, but I can appreciate myself in that imperfection. And sometimes I feel like people think about this pursuit of beauty as being superficial. And I kind of have to agree with them. Because sometimes finding that rough around the edges, which is what wabi-sabi is, or finding something and accepting it for what it is beautiful. Like you said, that tough lady with the tattoos. Of course she's beautiful, but maybe not in an aesthetic sense of this balance, symmetry, and all these things that I seek, an order that I seek in architecture. But in her being, she's beautiful, So I think, yeah, I'm a huge fan of wabi-sabi. I just think everyone should just be like themselves for who they are, and objects for what they are as well.
For those in the audience who aren't as familiar with this practice, it is kind of the art of making sort of broken things whole through art, and sort of the best known manifestation of this is bowls, like pottery that has been shattered, and then it's put back together, and the cracks are filled with sort of the grout is made of gold, actually. So instead of hiding the cracks in the art or the objects, you see it highlighted in this this powerful and expensive and sort of wonderful configuration.
But Christine, I kind of want to throw it back to you, right? You wrote this book, Rethinking Sex, which is about human beauty. And I think you argue in the book that, meeting people on dating apps is casual. It doesn't lead to a meaningful relationship. I'd really like to hear you talk about that, because what is meaning, if it's not that human beauty? Because when you're on a dating app, you are just judging person on one dimension, right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I thought that being the moderator meant that I didn't have to answer any questions. I never escaped.
Work like that. Equity.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And that actually goes back to what Sheri was saying about how we assign value to beauty. I'm just talking about a lot of things I dislike this morning. Not beauty, but the metaverse and dating apps. Maybe technology is the connector here. I find dating apps and the way that they highlight beauty a bit pernicious, because they tend to, only give you sort of the visual of someone. You see someone's picture, maybe a couple words of text, and you have to make a split second decision on that. And then there's the way that we as humans, and especially young people who are shaped by media, shaped by representation, often have these ideas of what is beautiful, these very stereotypical ideas of what is beautiful that they rely on and then perpetuate as they use dating apps. So, we tend to go for the blonde person, say, or, the person who's at least 6 feet tall, or these really stereotypical renderings of what is commonly sold to us as beauty. And we value those people, or those people see a lot of success in the dating market that's only image-based. And that leaves a lot of people out. That also leaves a lot of kinds of beauty out. And then, Anjan, I think probably you can talk a little bit more about this. As you continue to do this, you're continuing to swipe through people, picking based on a few concepts. You're sort of training yourself. You're training your brain to only appreciate a certain look or a certain person or people under a certain age. And then when that's reflected in our society, in the way that we have historically valued one type of beauty over the other, one race over the other, one sex over the other, you can begin to perpetuate, you can continue to perpetuate some really ugly stereotypes.
Yeah, this is a very rich area of conversation. It actually goes back to the 1860s. Francis Galton, many of you know, was a brilliant polymath. He was an anthropologist, a statistician, an explorer. He also was a eugenist, and a time where the term didn't quite have the same meaning that it took on afterwards. But he was giving an address, which you can find, it's fantastic, where he's talking about bringing to bear a new technology on a social situation. The new technology was photography. And his idea was that if he could take photographs of convicted felons and combine them, he would create the prototypic face of a criminal, right? So, all of our concerns about a surveillance state, but this was the idea. And he genuinely thought, okay, let's see what the physiognomy of the criminal person is. To his surprise, what he finds at the end of that is when he does this, that the images that come out of this are more beautiful than any of the individual faces that contributed to the combination. And this is an experimental finding that has been replicated many times, which is if you average across a diverse kind of faces, the face that comes out of it is more attractive, almost always, than any of the individual faces that contributes to it. So now 2 implications of that, which is that we are constantly building prototypes. We are doing the averaging in our brain without realizing it based on what we are exposed to. So if you grow up in a multicultural or a cosmopolitan place like DC or New York or Philadelphia or London, any major city, you have a much richer sense of the kinds of beauty that one might have, as opposed to if you just grow up in an environment that is monocultural. And now to take your point with social media, if you're just looking through TikTok or Instagram at these impossible standards of beauty that are filtered, that's also part of how you're forming these prototypes, and it completely distorts standards of beauty.
That makes so much sense. That's also rather alarming for, I think, the younger among us, especially any of us who have kids or teenagers.
Yeah, if I can, just one quick point about that is that since especially 2012, which was an inflection point, the rates of depression and suicide in teenagers has skyrocketed. And it almost correlates very closely with the use of social media. And at least one explanation for this is exactly this kind of comparison. It's especially true for young girls between the age of 10 and 14. And it looks as though this kind of comparative thing has a profound effect on people's self-esteem because these standards of beauty are put forth. So I think what you're saying is actually we're seeing the consequences of that for about the last 10 years.
So there really is that empirical evidence. Wow, this is so rich. We only have a few more minutes left, so I wanted to give you all a chance to, if you have just a final statement you want to say about beauty at work in any of the many ways that we've talked about it this morning, or where you're thinking you might take this in your research?
Well, one thing I want to say is that beauty is always at work, whether we are aware of it or not. So it's not that we need to infuse work with beauty or beauty with work. It's happening, as Anjan just, I think, made very clear, happening all the time, all around us anyway. And that's an important thing, I think, for us to know. We make all kinds of decisions based on aesthetic information. As he said, beauty, truth, intelligence. I mean, all of those things that have nothing to do with the abstraction of beauty, that we're constantly using it. There are studies that showed when word processing on computers that you could take the exact same paper that was, when I was in college, you were using whiteout, right? And you could have a typed paper with whiteout and one that was word processing.
I want to explain what whiteout is, because there might...
yes, for the younger whippersnappers in the room, you would type, and then if you made a mistake, because it was ink, you couldn't erase it. So it was white paint paste and a little brush, and you would paint over it, let it dry, and go type some more, and let it dry, and then type over it again. So it had a Band-Aid on it in a way. So you get these papers with these little patches. And when more fluent students began to get ones that looked like all of our papers do now, there was a period where they were doing studies and found that the exact same content that was pretty was getting higher grades. So it's not just people, it's all around us that we make these collapsing of beauty and truth and beauty and what we've, I think, added on is that what we perceive as beauty, depending on where we are and who we are, is so we're making these decisions all the time.
I'm not a researcher, but I read somewhere that if you work in a space that is 10 feet high, your creativity goes up. And I think, Anjan, you wrote about this, about the volume of the space. So I've just moved my entire team into a massive space. So I'll let you know the results of that if creativity is actually on the up. So that's what I'm doing next.
One of the good things about AI that is transforming, and it will transform everything within 6 months to a year, if not less. And in the context of everything we're talking about, social media, also the Zoom and all that, is that you will not be able to believe anything anymore unless you are present. I mean, you won't be able to believe anything. And to me, that brings back reality to a level of embodiment and of this, that actually makes our life more real than ever, and architecture perhaps, and the arts even more relevant, and social interaction more real than ever. To me, that's a fantastic development, despite all the spin negative that we hear. To me, that's a positive development. We had to have some positive development. The other thing I want to say just quickly is that, going back to this sense of crying with architecture, right? I believe architecture changes people, and if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be an architect. And that I choose to be voluntarily naive. And that's why I do some research trying to prove it. But the other aspect of this is that all of us that try to pray or meditate, we know how hard it is to get to that point in which you could be really open, right? What architecture or the arts and the beauty or music does is produce that effect without effort. You go to that place without effort because the object or the space or the art is so powerful that consumes all your attention. So the frontal cortex doesn't have to make any effort anymore to bring attention back, but you are catapulted in this state of complete presence. So that's a very powerful thing to add to the conversation.
Anjan, want to round us out?
I think what, over the next few years, I'm excited about, this touches on previous comments, is the kind of phenomenology which Julio is very interested in, the first-person experience, the kind of embodied experience, the hand and the indigo, the being in nature, this kind of first-person experience and the the program as a scientist, which is always about third-person accounts, and how do we bring those together? And so this idea of what is the connection between qualitative first-person accounts and quantitative descriptions of those accounts in a way that we can actually do some science on. And in an ironic way, while AI is going to really mess us up in many ways, it also, I think, has the potential to bridge this gap. And we're particularly interested, again, how do we get phenomenology, first-person qualitative accounts, mapped onto third-person quantitative accounts? And we might start to have the technology to begin to do that and combined with physiologic measures. So over the next 5 years, that's what I'm excited about, that might happen in our field.
So it seems a good place for us to leave off right now is thinking about beauty at work as actually being beauty lived, beauty embodied, and that may be where we've always been, but also where we're going next. And I think that's where you'll all be going next in the various panels and discussions that you're headed to. But please just give a round of applause for this great and fascinating panel. Conversation, and you can find more about our speakers in the booklets, but I'll let Brandon take you to the next part of our conference.